Good evening, everybody. If you're all set, we're going to get underway now. So tonight we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Charles Escher-Small, the Executive Director of ISGAP here. My name is Ira Guberman. I'm the Manager of Programming and Operations here at ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. Just wanted to bring your attention, there are a couple other events that will be taking place at Columbia University. In this room at 6 p.m. later on this semester, we'll be having Seth Stevens-Davowitz, Times writer, a former Google data scientist, and a Harvard Econ PhD. And he'll be speaking on anti-Semitism on the web, sure to be an up-and-coming topic. And on April 20th, in this room, we'll have Dr. Yehudi Barsky speaking on violence against Jews in the United States, a historical perspective and analysis. And both those events, as well as this event, happen because of people supporting the work of ISGAP. So you will notice there are pledge cards, and please feel free to use them if you have the ability to do so. So as I mentioned, tonight's speaker is Dr. Charles Escher-Small. Dr. Small is the founding director and president of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, ISGAP. He's also a visiting professor at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle East and African Studies, Tel Aviv University, and was the Koret Distinguished Fellow, Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Charles received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, McGill University, Montreal, Master's in Science and Urban Development, Planning and Economics, Development Planning Unit, University College London, and a Doctorate of Philosophy, St. Anthony's College, Oxford University. And he's had several other accomplishments, which I'm sure we might touch on tonight. But at that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Small.
So thanks, Ira. That was a serious introduction. So Ira is the coordinator. He runs our New York office, and Chris recently joined us, and he's in charge of development. Ira, the sound is bad. Yeah. Can you adjust it? It's like a weird feedback. Okay. Or you can. It's like tinny. Okay, sorry. Is this better? Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks. So Chris recently joined us, and he's the new Director of Development at ISGAP. So he's with us in New York as well. And ISGAP is a 501c3 in the United States. We're a charitable organization in Canada, which is the highest level of status you can get in Canada. And we're also a nonprofit in Europe and an Amuta in Israel. And we have a Canadian director in Montreal, Michelle Whiteman. Our European director is Robert Hassan at Sapienza University. And Mala Tabori, who's a professor of law, is our director in Israel. And we run seminars, so there's a few new people here. We run seminars at universities such as Columbia, McGill, La Sapienza in Rome, La Sorbonne, Tel Aviv, and other universities. And we run a teacher training program at Oxford University where we bring professors from all over the world to teach courses on contemporary anti-Semitism. So we invite professors. We signed a contract with the university that the professor coming to our program will teach a course for credits at their home university upon completion of our program. And we're entering into our third year. Yesterday was the final day of receiving applicants, and we've received about 65 applicants for 28 spaces from professors from all over the world. And I think this is our best group of professors so far that we've received, professors from all over the world, so it should be a good program. And we get the best scholars on contemporary anti-Semitism to teach the professors. The professors are our students. And we work with Carlton Long, who's a Rhodes Scholar from Oxford, the youngest mayor in the history of the United States from Gary, Indiana, an African-American expert on education and pedagogy. So he works with the professors for months leading up to the program, and he helps to to help them to create their own courses on the program. And Professor Larry Amsel of Columbia University, a friend and colleague, will be at the program this summer, hopefully. Nice to see you, Larry. So this is sort of what we do. And we also do strategic research projects. We're working with the European Union and 15 Jewish organizations from around the world, which is a feat in itself. I can write a book about that one day. But 15 Jewish organizations have come together with the European Union, and we're creating a tool, a sophisticated tool to measure anti-Semitism. So the European Union has fantastic laws against anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination, but they don't measure it. They don't look to see what's happening in their societies. So we're working with Seth, who's going to be speaking here in a couple of weeks. He writes for the New York Times, but he's also an expert in computers and algorithms and that sort of stuff. So we're working with sophisticated people, people from security forces, from high-tech companies, sociologists, professionals who monitor, who are protecting Jewish communities around the world as we speak. We're coming together at the European Union for a second round of meetings in a couple of weeks in Vienna. And hopefully, if this tool becomes successful, the European Union, we hope, will adopt the tool. So we're doing that. We're also doing work on the BDS movement, which I know our friends from Greenwich are very much involved in that. So nice to thank you for coming. There's a group of people starting an organization called Galvanize. You can speak with them after. But people who are very concerned about what's happening on campuses in terms of the BDS and how students are being affected. What we're doing in terms of BDS is following the money. We're working with forensic accountants, and we're following money coming into the country, but also following money within the country, surprisingly. Major multinational corporations that are here funding universities at the highest levels, not just student stuff, but affecting institutions and curriculum. So we're engaged in that project, and that is, we're trying to look at the reasons for, not just the symptoms of the problem, but to find out the cause. So that's some of the things that we do. And just as I was coming here, so tonight I'm speaking about the roots of anti-Semitism. I'm going to speak about the alt-right, European nationalism, and radical political Islam. And just as I was coming here, I was speaking to a friend, Glenn Feder, who's a professor. Hello. A professor, Glenn Feder, who's working with me on the BDS project. And Glenn is in Paris, philosopher, student of philosophy, and we wrote the sort of the history of the Muslim Brotherhood at American universities. And I just spoke to him, and he's based in Paris now. And in France today, I don't know if people saw the news, but in France there was two Jewish people in Bondy, which is a northeastern suburb of Paris. They were wearing kippahs, two brothers. Their father is a leader of the Jewish community in the suburbs of Paris. And they were abducted for a short period of time, and one of the brothers had his finger amputated by North African assailants who were screaming, "Kill the Jews." And this is, we know that we are now in a situation where things are, yeah, it's a bad sound.
Back row hears you clearly.
Pardon?
Back row hears you clearly.
Who hears me clearly?
Back row.
Back row. Maybe this will be better. Is this better? All right. Can you hear me better? You want to move up? I'm sorry for this. Is this better? It's okay? Okay. So we're in a situation where we know that anti-Semitism is spiking. I had an interesting conversation with Yehuda Reinhardt, the former president of Brandeis University, he wrote a book about 3 years ago in German, and it just came out in English. And it's a book of letters that people wrote to the Israeli embassy in Berlin. and expressing their views on Israel and on Jews. And what Professor Reinhardt was saying is that the people writing these anti-Semitic letters to the Israeli embassy are predominantly well-educated, middle and upper middle class people, highly educated people. So this is not the riffraff. And in the work that we do, and I've been saying this, and my colleagues have been saying this for a long time, is that the intellectuals, Western intellectuals in this sort of postmodern moment, have acquiesced to their liberal democratic beliefs, to their liberalism, in the face of short-term benefits and short-term gains, i.e., engaging the Muslim Brotherhood, engaging the Iranian revolutionary regime, engaging reactionary social movements that are diametrically opposed to liberal democratic values. And there's everybody in this room, whether you support the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, whether you were a fan of Obama or you're a fan of Trump, whether you're from another country, I'm certain that everybody in this room would believe that everybody ought to be equal under one legal system, regardless of our gender, of our religion, of our race, of our language, of our economic standing in society, that every citizen ought to be treated equally under one legal system. And we live in a moment where Western democratic countries have been engaging reactionary social movements, and anti-Semitism, which is at the core of these reactionary social movements, have provided the distraction that anti-Semitism always does. So while we look at the Jew, while we look at the Zionist, while we look at the Israeli, over here, societies are being transformed, and there's a revolutionary taking place. I think it was Martin Luther King who spoke about the story of Rip Van Winkle and sleeping through the revolution. And he was speaking about how American intellectuals and the media of record and the major cultural institutions of the United States of America were sleeping through the revolution of civil rights, were sleeping through the revolution of integration and the movement for equality in this country. And what Martin Luther King said is that in music events, in sporting events, white people and black people were coming together. Yet in churches, in universities, in the media, that this integration was way behind to what was happening at the grassroots level. People were sleeping through a revolution. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm ashamed and sad to say that we've been sleeping through a revolution. We in the academy and we in the media of record have been sleeping through a revolution that's been transforming the Middle East and transforming the suburbs of Paris and the suburbs of London. And this is a serious issue. And this is an issue that the West refused to engage. And we refuse to engage it because of this sort of philosophical and intellectual moment that we're in. And my colleagues and I have been saying that the vacuum of our silence will cause a backlash. And people have been writing, my colleagues at the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, for more than 10 years have been ringing the alarm bell that we live in a global society. And if we're denying the rights of Jews in the Middle East, or the rights of women in Gaza, or the rights of Baha'is in Iran, or Sunnis and Shiites where they are minorities, that when we deny the rights of gay people in the Middle East, and say nothing and do nothing and legitimize these forces for short-term gain, that we have to realize that we're living in a world where ideas and people travel, and our silence, our denial of the problem, our inability and our unwillingness to look at these sexist, homophobic, genocidal, anti-Semitic movements, and I'm saying this as a scholar, these are genocidal anti-Semitism, that somehow for 8 years in this country, unlike other countries, it's not as bad as other countries, but in this country, we are not allowed to say those words. We're not allowed to speak the issue. We can't as Norman Potterot said, we can't speak the hate of anti-Semitism. It's the hate that we dare not speak its name, because to speak its name, somehow we're racist, somehow we're Islamophobic, somehow we're right-wing, somehow we're fascist, somehow we're anti-human rights, somehow we're Zionists, as if this was a sin. But it's the silence, ladies and gentlemen, to engage the ideas of radical political Islam. It's our silence that tragically and seriously, I would argue, is bringing about the sort of revival of nationalism, of European nationalism, the revival of xenophobia, anti-immigration feeling, anti-Semitism, and other forms of sort of denying the humanity of the other. And this is our failure. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is not liberalism. This is not human rights. And in this country, in the academy, and I'll explain why in a moment, but I would say, thanks to postmodernity and the best education money can buy, we have misled two generations, and the cost in blood is rising as we speak. So when I say postmodernity, it sort of evolves philosophically after the Second World War. And I am a critical scholar. I'm Canadian, Israeli, grew up in social democratic countries. I went to McGill University for $200 a year. I had health care that was not a business, that my doctors took care of me and in the culture of preventative medicine. I still go there if I can. If I'm not too sick, I'll go to see my Canadian doctors because it's not a business. And I come from a country and a society and a belief system as a social democracy, a student of Erwin Kotler, of Charles Taylor, of James Tully, of Emmanuel Levinas, a place that recognizes the other in society. Emmanuel Levinas, who took, the people know his work, so a few people know him. Emmanuel Levinas was born in Lithuania. He studied in France. When he was doing his PhD in France, the Holocaust broke out. His family was exterminated completely. He survived in France. He went on to become perhaps one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. And I'm being crude, but I'm describing him in 30 seconds, but he essentially brought Jewish thought, Jewish ethics, and Talmudic thinking to the university. And he famously said that and this is based on Pirkei Avot and Talmudic thought, that when we see our face in the face of the other, this is the instant we become human. When we see our face in the face of the other, this is when we're human. And it's the space that we need to, the ethics, the way we see and perceive and treat the other in society is the cornerstone, the foundation of any humane society. And if there's reactionary social movements like radical political Islam, which I'll speak to in a moment, I'm not speaking about Islam, I'm speaking about political Islam. The Muslim Brotherhood, the Iranian revolutionary regime, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Muslim Brotherhood, the student struggle, the students for justice in Palestine, who come from this ideological bent, who do not perceive the other as human. If you're a woman, you're subjugated. You're less than a man. If you're gay, you deserve to be killed. And if you're a Jew, what radical politicalism does is take, and I'm not being exaggerating, I'm speaking as a scholar, they take Nazi European anti-Semitism and they fused it with their religion. This is a deviation from Islam, and it's this type of political Islam which is rising to power. And they perceive the Jews in the view of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was the text that justified the removing of Jews from European society, that demonized Jews to being subhuman. And people, you can read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It was a text that spoke of a meeting, a secret meeting where Jews met to take over the world, of society. It was a forged document, a fake document that came out of France or Russia, depending on which, some say France, some say Russia, in the late 1800s. And it was the lies that justified removing Jews from society, putting them into ghettos, and ultimately into the final solution. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion has been plagiarized by the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. If you plagiarize in the academy, that's the greatest sin. They've basically lifted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and fused it at the core of this political Islamic social movement. So the calling for the destruction of Jews, the conspiracy of Jews to take over the world, the diseases that Jews create and spread throughout the world, all these cabals, all these horrific, genocidal, anti-Semitic tropes are at the core. It's not the radical edge of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not the military wing of Hamas. It's the core. It's the intellectual core, the ideological core of this reactionary social movement. Perceiving the Jew in the most pernicious ways ever, in the spirit, if you will, of the Nazis, of European Nazis. And yet, in this postmodern moment, the workings of Michel Foucault, Edward Said, the two of them in particular, two champions, I may add, of the Iranian Revolution, two champions of the Iranian Revolution, because Said and Michel Foucault hung out in France in the 1970s. They hung out with the Iranians who were in exile, religious Iranians, the Ayatollahs in Iran. And they thought that the Iranian Revolution was going to be akin to what the French Revolution was to Europe and Enlightenment was to Europe, that the Iranian Revolution was going to usher in an era of civilization and enlightenment, if you will, into the Muslim world. So Foucault and Said promoted the Iranian Revolution and that ideology. And why did they promote it? So postmodernity gets away from the sort of the notion of modernity, of development, of modernization, of state-regulated societies, of economic progress, of binary oppositions, right? If you're black, you're white, you're French, you're British, you're German, very sort of strict boxes and categories of modernity. This was sort of modern thinking. And after the Second World War, after the excesses of nationalism, of racism, of colonialism, after the catastrophe of the Holocaust and the Second World War that destroyed Europe, intellectuals began to say that we have to sort of deconstruct these very sort of strong ideologies. And people, that every narrative, if you will, British narratives, French narratives, Jewish British narratives, women, gay people, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, people with different politics, different political views, that every narrative should be treated with respect and understood. And not everybody is German, not everybody is British, right? There's Jewish people, there's Muslim people, there's working class people and rich people. There's all sorts of, all these societies are not hegemonic, but they are hybrid. Everybody has hybrid identities, and every narrative should be understood. So the notion of good and evil, of right and wrong, becomes relativized by intellectuals, by philosophy. So this sort of ushered in, I'm being very basic and crude, but this sort of ushers in this sort of movement away from modernity and the excesses of nationalism philosophically into a space where we have to frown upon hegemony. So the most hegemonic or the strongest country in the world is the United States of America and the West was colonizing and oppressing and interfering, and the United States, after the Second World War, was sort of inherited the mantle of this legacy. So part of the sort of postmodern moment is sort of critiquing Western hegemony, critiquing the United States, critiquing the history of colonialism. And you have to say, some of the critique is important, right? The racism that was a part of modernity, the anti-Semitism, it's a part of modernity, the negation of many people's histories, colonialism, imperialism. These are things that should be critically examined, racism, sexism, and the like. So the postmodern moment ushered in cultural studies and the sort of critique of Western thought. Important. But when we take this sort of very superficial view that those who were once colonized, those who were once the victims of Western oppression could do no wrong, this is where we fall into a problematic world. And it was the teachings of Michel Foucault, the teachings of Edward Said in particular, that in a sense, I would say almost handcuffs intellectuals, scholars, journalists in media, in the media of record, important public intellectuals, from engaging in a critique of the other and engaging in a critique of those who were once colonized. So if Palestinians stand up, if people in the Middle East stand up to Western hegemony, we can't critique them because they're brown, because they were once oppressed, because we were once colonized. Edward Said, with Orientalism, sort of puts, I would say, an intellectual handcuff on the West. So yes, women in New York are entitled to be equal under the law. Women in New York are entitled to have control over their bodies. But women in Gaza, and women in Sudan, and women in Tehran, if you speak about their rights, then this is a form of Western domination and a neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism, and how dare we? When Palestinians speak about exterminating Jews, when Palestinians speak about destroying Israel, when the roots, when the intellectual and ideological and religious roots of this reactionary form of Palestinian identity, not all Palestinians are the same, of course, but this force, this intellectual, ideological, and political force in Palestinian society, and I'll explain the roots of it in a moment, throughout the Middle East, this demonization of Jews is something that we still, to this day, especially in this institution, we cannot speak freely about. And as many of you know, we had a research center, the first research center at Yale University that dealt with anti-Semitism. And a lot of our work dealt with the anti-Semitism of the Middle East, of the Iranian revolutionary regime, of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we had the finest scholars in the world, literally, from all over the world, from Israel, from Syria, from Egypt, from Europe, from throughout the Americas. Leading scholars of Islam, leading scholars of the Middle East, leading scholars of sociology, religious studies, coming to our center, that the critique of this sort of emerging or even dominant reactionary social movement was perceived among white liberals, Jews included, as something that was not scholarship, as something that was political advocacy. Because how can we critique a critique of Zionism? How can we critique a critique of Zionism, which is an offshoot of Western American, European imperialism? If we look at the anti-Semitism coming out of the Palestinian society, the Egyptian society, Syria, Iran, Iraq, we must be not scholars, we must be Zionist advocates. And if you're an advocate in the academy, it's extraordinarily problematic. So looking at the emergence of this form of religion, of this sort of form of ideology, looking at the ideological roots, how people, Qutb and Banai, two founding fathers of the Muslim Brotherhood, two intellectuals who were writing as a reaction to British colonialism 80 years ago, who formed an ideological and intellectual reaction to European colonialism and domination in the Middle East, sort of fused European anti-Semitism, highly influenced by the Nazis, by the Germans, because they were both fighting the British, and how, looking at the development of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, how it spreads into Wahhabism, how it influences Iraq, how it influences the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian thinking, Yasser Arafat, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, the offshoot Hamas, an offshoot of a direct, descendant of the Muslim Brotherhood, how this is a Sunni movement. We had scholars that looked, people like Bassam Tibi, Uzi Rabi, David Menashri, leading scholars, looking at how the Sunni movement that was at odds with Shiite Islam, how the Sunnis influenced the Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution. So the Sunnis influencing the Shiites, Ayatollah Khomeini naming streets and monuments throughout Persian Shiite society after Sunni revolutionaries from the Muslim Brotherhood. So the intellectual and political roots of the Shiite Iranian revolutionary regime paying homage and thanking the revolutionaries of the Sunni world, which are kind of enemies of each other. So looking at that history, the influence of the British, the influence of the Germans and the Nazis in the Middle East, looking at Faisal Husseini, looking at the Imam of Jerusalem, Husseini, and his ties, Jeffrey Herf, Bassam Tibi, writing very important books of the influence of the Nazis on the emergence of the nascent sort of Palestinian movement, people like Benny Morris and others. This was not perceived, and is not perceived to this day in the academy as serious scholarship, but somehow defending Zionism and somehow defining neo-imperialism, and is somehow reactionary, to critique, to study as scientists, as philosophers, as sociologists, this rapidly changing world. And of course, the Iranian revolutionary regime, which exports terror, which exports anti-Semitism, Nazi-based anti-Semitism, distributing it throughout the world, throughout society. And we see today, literally, a genocide occurring in Syria, and where are the students? Where are the intellectuals? How is it possible that the leaders of the Western democratic world, the P5+6, led by President Obama, transferring up to $150 billion worth of resources, trade, business, Boeing, Siemens Computers, doing business with a regime of that nature for short-term Western gain, for a few pieces of silver, bringing a revolutionary regime into the family of nations, empowering it in a way that now they are supporting Assad, and Assad is killing his own citizens, where estimates of up to 500,000 people, if not more, have been civilians caught up in this battle, 13 to 14 million refugees, and we in these ivory towers somehow think that it can stay there. So we don't have to do anything. Red lines, Samantha Powers writing books on genocide, it's over there. But we see that the destabilization in the Middle East with 14 million refugees, we see people leaving their homes, people fleeing a genocide, a preventable genocide, a genocide that happens in real time. You can Google it and you can watch it tonight. We're living in the information age. There are dozens of serious sources of information that we can Google, and we can watch the genocide in real time, which we aid and abet. And now the refugees are coming into Europe, and they're coming here according to Donald Trump. Not many are coming here, but the media is filled with this sort of rejection of the other and the fear of the other. And the rise of European racism and European xenophobia, nationalism, anti-Semitism is there. It's on the rise. And in places like Belgium and France, and with Brexit in the United Kingdom, we have people, swaths of people, that have been left behind by neoliberal globalization, that are reacting. And they are fearful. And this message of fear, unfortunately, I would contend, is getting great traction. And it's getting great traction because the intellectuals and the community that's supposed to be the defenders of democratic principles, the defenders of liberalism, the defenders of democratic principles, we have been silent because we weren't allowed to speak about it. I remember I was on a television show and the Canadian Parliament was attacked, and it was happening live, and we didn't know what was happening. And the person, I'm Canadian, so the person said, "What do you think is happening in Ottawa?" So I said, "I know exactly what's happening in Ottawa. An Islamist is attacking the Canadian Parliament, and tonight President Obama will say that there was a terrorist attack, and it's too early to say what's going on, and we'll investigate it." And I told the presenter that Obama will come on 5 minutes before Prime Minister Harper and suck the oxygen out of the Prime Minister's response. And that's exactly what happened. The sort of denial of 49 people murdered in a gay bar in Florida. He was psychologically disturbed, right? Gay citizens, we can't speak out to protect their rights even here. So I would submit to you that our silence, the traditionally liberal, truly liberal, human rights-minded people who defend democratic principles and human rights, we've been schooled to remain silent through this revolution. And the tragedy is, our silence is creating a vacuum in which European nationalism is rising, and President Trump, whether it's intended or not, we can speak about that in a moment, is fueling the European nationalism and the fears that are happening in Europe. And today's example with the anti-Semitic attack is real. And we have situations in France, in Belgium, where Jewish people are leaving in great numbers. And one study that has not been done, so there's studies that show approximately 14 or 15,000 French Jews are moving to Israel. Many are going to Canada, the United States, and Britain, and other countries that we're not exactly clear of. So there's probably about 25 or 30,000 Jews leaving France. And what has not been studied yet, which is a fascinating subject, is that Jewish people in traditional Jewish communities in the suburbs around France and on the outskirts of France, where they've lived for 4 or 5 generations, mostly from North Africa, they're moving. They're leaving their Jewish neighborhoods that they live close to Muslim and immigrant communities, and they're leaving to other safer places. So that's a whole area that we don't know how many people are moving. And in 2009, I wrote an article with Ed Kaplan of Yale showing the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And we interviewed 5,000 people in 10 European countries. It was a major study. And the publisher, there was actually, we interviewed people and we broke down the analysis by education, by levels of education, class, income, and also by religion. And the publisher didn't want to publish the article because it showed that Muslims were much more anti-Semitic than Christians in France. And in 2009, that was not appropriate, even though the science was good. We interviewed a lot of people. It was a serious project. So we had to go with another publisher, another journal that would actually publish the article. Our first choice wouldn't do it unless we would take out the statistic. So there's been the silencing of this, and I think this silence is leading to the vacuum. So, the alt-right. The alt-right is I think it's an interesting and important phenomenon. And I think that intellectuals, we should engage it, we should understand it. The fact that Bannon traces intellectually and ideologically has a strong connection to an Italian fascist thinker and philosopher, that there are things going on in the United States and associated with this administration that I think we should take very seriously. And it's very important. And I think looking at the alt-right and looking at how the intellectual, the sort of so-called alt-right, which is sort of intellectual, very extreme right-wing, racist, fascistic in its ideological origins, how it's connected to grassroots marginalization and disenfranchisement among many people in the United States. And there is, I don't think there's going to be a fascist, sort of race war in the United States, but there are grumblings that are going on in the United States that are real. I lived in New Haven, Connecticut when I was at Yale. I lived there for 10 years, and I had friends that were sort of in Oxford, Connecticut, that were sort of over the hill from Yale in kind of white, very white, working class communities. Mill towns, factories that have just been decimated. The best job you can get if you're lucky is if Walmart comes in and pays you minimum wage with maybe 1 or 2 professional jobs. These are communities that have been, really, really decimated, living next to extraordinarily wealth in Connecticut among white people. And I have friends, colleagues that were very left-wing, supported Obama. They all voted for Trump. There's a lot of dissatisfaction happening in this country, and I think as scholars we need to engage it. And there is this sort of emerging of an intellectual, ideological leadership that is beginning to resonate, and it's beginning to resonate because of the levels of marginalization. At the same time, I would argue emphatically that Donald Trump's anti-Semitism is really, in my opinion, at this point, kind of problematic to even start to blame him for anti-Semitism. The bomb scares that have been going all over the United States, and there's many now. The ADL got one yesterday. This is sort of becoming maybe there's copycats going on as well. But this anti-Semitism, I would argue, is sort of superficial, or these are symptoms, or these are kind of a descriptive analysis of what's going on. The fact that there's bomb scares going on and President Trump and administration has been in power for a month, I don't think as scholars we can sort of blame him for that. He was silent. He spoke oddly about it for a few weeks, but he finally condemned it. The vice president did something well. The UN ambassador spoke incredibly about anti-Semitism. But I think in a way, we have to really, instead of having a descriptive analysis, try to understand what's happening sociological, economically, and culturally. And the fact that the West has engaged a genocidal anti-Semitic movement and brought them into the family of nations, ideology and ideas travel. When the Secretary of the United States of America on Yom HaShoah, this I'll never forget, 2 years ago, I was at a conference at the United Nations on Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, and Kerry said the night before that Israel may become an apartheid state, that he was worried that Israel would be an apartheid state. So the headlines all over the world on Yom HaShoah was Israel is an apartheid state or Israel's becoming an apartheid state. Now we in this room will shake our heads and say it's terrible. He's anti-Semitic, or he misspoke, or he didn't understand what he was doing. We can have a whole debate about what he meant or didn't mean. But this is how we hear it. But how is it heard in the suburbs of Paris? How is it heard in the halls of the Ivy Leagues? How is it heard and understood in the West Bank and Gaza? How is it heard and perceived among the Iranian regime? How is it perceived when President Obama invited as honored guests in his first speech in Cairo and sat in the first row the Muslim Brotherhood? So we in the West said that this was Mr. Clapper said this was a heterogeneous secular movement. But we know, if you study this, this is a movement that calls for the extermination of Jews as a core belief. And these were honored guests by the President of the United States of America. How does that resonate? And in our studies, we see, in following the money, billions of dollars going into the finest institutions in this country, media outlets, Ivy Leagues, the best universities in this country, receiving money from the Muslim Brotherhood, from Qatar. And in our research, finding out that major corporations in the United States, pharmaceutical companies in Cambridge, Massachusetts, donating tens upon tens of millions of dollars to Ivy League universities at a time. And how does that impact? We had a professor from Georgetown University, a recent convert to a very Islamist program at Georgetown University, very important university and a very important city, saying the most outlandish things. Now here, I'm going to show you a clip, if it's still on. Whoops. Ira. So this is a clip from Yosef Kawadari. Kawadari is the chief rabbi of the Muslim Brotherhood. He's the most respected intellectual and religious leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. I hope you can make it.
Oh, that's weird.
So Kawadari runs the Qatari Foundation out of Qatar. The Qatari Foundation is very close to the Qatari regime. They fund universities like Columbia, like Yale, like Georgetown, highly, but this is foreign funded universities are easier to track, easy to find. But there's corporations here who are also on the payroll of the Muslim Brotherhood, American institutions, American corporations that are funding as well. So Kawadari happens to have started the Islamic Studies Institute at Oxford University. I'm a graduate of Oxford. So my alma mater has this character, this great intellectual and religious leader. As the head, he's resigned now, but he was the head of the Islamic Studies at Oxford. And look at what this great intellectual from Oxford has to say. And this is not some sort of, I don't know, guy saying something out of turn. This is something that these people believe. You'll be able to see it. I think you use it.
Oh, we got no screen. Is the mouse moving? Okay, so you're saying. What's up there?
طوال التاريخ من يؤدبهم نتيجة إفسادهم. آخر تأديب كان تأديب هتلر، ما فعل بهم، وإن كان مبالغوا في الأمر ما بلغوا، ولكن استطاع أن يعني يوقفهم عند حدودهم، وكان هذا أدبا إلهيا، تأديبا إلهيا، عقابا قدريا لهؤلاء. والمرة القادمة إن شاء الله ستكون على أيدي المؤمنين. كل ما أتمناه في ختام كلمتي هذا أن يهيئ الله لي في ختام حياتي فرصة للذهاب إلى أرض الجهاد والمقاومة على كرسي متحرك، فأطلق رصاصة على أعداء الله اليهود، ويطلقون علي قنبلة أختم بها حياتي بالشهادة، وأقول الحمد لله رب العالمين، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
So in a way, they believe that it's God's will, that God punished the Jews, and that the believers have. So this, if you can hold it for a second. So this is my colleague. We have ISGAP has a branch in Chile, in Santiago, Chile, and we do some research there. And my friend was invited to, his name is Oliver, losing my memory here. My colleague ISGAP in Chile. So Oscar he's very active in academic circles and in industry and in the sort of diplomatic, political world. He does heavy industry, big industry. So he was invited to a speech at a diplomatic club of the Chilean government by the PLO ambassador to Chile. And you can see the protocols sort of permeating his speech. And actually, my friend filmed it, and we sent it to the newspapers, and he actually lost his position, thanks to Oscar and ISGAP. And a lot of media picked it up, and he was called back to Ramallah, and he got into trouble. But this is consistent with the Muslim Brotherhood's belief, which Fatah and Hamas are intellectually and ideologically connected.
Hasta el 1896, cuando un grupo de intelectuales, académicos, financieros, la mayoría europeos y no judíos, decidieron la creación del movimiento sionista con un pretexto de la creación de una patria o un hogar para los judíos, aunque la verdad es a proteger sus planes para dominar la vida de toda la humanidad en el planeta, según el libro Los Protocolos de los Sabios de Sion, que fue publicado en el 1923, descubierto por Lenin después del triunfo de la revolución bolchevique en Rusia. En ese libro llaman a la destrucción de las moralidades de las otras religiones. En ese libro ponen planes de manipulación de todos los aparatos financiera, económica, industrial en todo el mundo. Hablan sobre la manipulación de las fuerzas políticas locales en los distintos países.
This is for the protocols. Thanks. So, I think to sum it up, those of us who study anti-Semitism have been saying that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. And this is what we always say. And you know, sometimes you say something and you don't understand the implications of what you're saying. And if you think about it, what's happening in the Middle East today is very much this notion that it begins with the Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews. And anti-Semitism is a type of hatred that once it's unleashed on society, it knows no boundaries. And if you look at Europe, it started with Jews, but ended with 80 million Europeans killed, destroyed. The economy, the infrastructure, devastated throughout the continent. And we see the same thing happening tragically, horrifically, before our eyes in real time on the internet. But as long as they were saying it's okay with the Israelis and the Jews and the Zionists, nobody paid attention. And now the Middle East was on fire and nobody really cared too much. But now it's this destruction is entering into Europe. It's entering here. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to react to it, a la nationalism and xenophobia? Or are we going to react to the problem, to study it, to understand it, to go deep and be scholarly in the best sense of the world, to understand what are the processes happening in our society, what are the interests competing in our society. One of the things I was very active in the question of Iran and looking at the ideology of Iran, but also promoting the boycott against the regime. And one of the things that shocked a lot of my colleagues was that we underestimated the forces in the West. We underestimated Boeing, $25 billion contract with Iran, Siemens, the oil industry. There are forces here that are our friends, and yet are they threatening democratic principles not just in Iran, but are they threatening democratic principles here? If a university is taking money from these characters, and they are taking money from these characters, a lot of money, what are the implications for these institutions? The university, the media of record, these are the core of a society, the core of a democratic society. And the question is, what are the implications of another generation of leaders coming out of this school and other schools who cannot speak out against this hate? And I remember at Columbia University when Ahmadinejad was a guest here and he spoke, he said that there were no gay people in Iran, and the Middle East Studies Center here, the best in the country, the graduate students and the faculty laughed because they thought it was outrageous. How can there not be gay people in Iran? Of course there are gay people in Iran. But Ahmadinejad is not a stupid guy. And when he said there are no gay people in Iran, he meant there are no gay people in Iran, because if you're gay in Iran, you are in trouble. You'll be executed, you'll be forcibly undergoing sex change operations, or put into prison. And yet the intellectuals here are not engaged in the ideas that drive these reactionary social movements. So we need to understand it, and we need to understand how our society, how our education of citizens, the values that we are inculcating with our students and with the readers of our papers and the CNN, which takes money from the Qatari Foundation, what are they doing to the health of democracy and citizenship in this country? So I think, in a sense, anti-Semitism it's a phenomenon of early warning, early warning radar system. And when Jews start to feel uncomfortable, and they are feeling uncomfortable in Europe, they're feeling uncomfortable at McGill, and they're feeling uncomfortable in St. Louis, and they're feeling uncomfortable now when you send your kid to a JCC. And I started this, I grew up in Montreal, I'll just end with this. And in my generation, everything was open to Jewish kids of my generation. My father couldn't go to McGill because of the Jewish quota, and his generation had to go to Jewish hospitals and live in a Jewish neighborhood, but that's a whole other story. But we were free to do and study and go and be whatever we wanted. And I remember coming home for a Shabbat dinner at my sister's house, and I lived in a community where my parents were all friends with their generation. I was friends with the second generation of people, and my sister and her friends moved to another kind of neighborhood, a little bit fancier, and the grandchildren and the children and the parents, it's like 3 generations of a community, of a real community. And I remember coming home to my sisters from Connecticut one Friday afternoon, and she was on the phone with her friends saying, what do we tell the children? Because a mother and son from Hezbollah firebombed the Jewish school, the Herzliya school in Montreal, and the fire caught and burnt down the library. What do you tell? My sister has 3 boys. Now they're 23, 21, and 13. And the discussion in my sister's house was, what do you say to the kids and what not to say to the kids? And I was watching this unfold, and I thought, oh my God, what is happening? This was Montreal 15 years ago. And now it's accelerating. So I'll just end there. I'll be happy to take questions or comments, but I think the issue is, especially in the academy, is that we need the best minds to understand what's happening. We need the best scholars and the best intellectuals to engage the issue, to argue, to debate, but engage it and not to remain silent through the revolution. So thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions.
With anti-Semites, really, as you said, starts with the Jews. And I tell you what, and I'm asking a question too. When they did the death of Klinghoffer,
Yeah.
it wasn't a death, it was killing, it was obviously tremendous anti-Semitism. The Jews still go to the Akba, they still support the Akba, and most of the money comes from Jews. When Ahmadinejad came to this university, the alumni didn't say, we stopped giving you money. Now, we're not starting to throw stones and burn things, but money does talk, and we don't use it. And we let them get away with that. Any of those places, or Roger Waters, if they mention anything about gay people, they would never have a show again. Or if they did something against blacks, the Metropolitan would have to close their doors. And anybody can do anything with the Jews because we keep quiet, because we're nice, because we buried ourselves, and that's why it happened. Now, I'd like you also to refer to Brandeis, yeah, when they what do you call it? Dishonor yeah? I mean, and we're still giving money, we're still so glad that we graduate or whatever. And this is where that is start and end. It's with us.
So I don't disagree. I would just say this very quickly. I'll give you my the history of anti-Semitism in 60 seconds. So there's three phases, so forgive me, there's three phases of anti-Semitism, but there's something that connects them. There's three general phases. There was sort of the religious phase, the racist phase, and the contemporary phase. The religious phase, people believed that Jews were blinded by evil or the devil for not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah, and that they were blinded and they'll never have redemption. But what makes anti-Semitism genocidal is that people believed that not only was the individual Jewish redemption impossible, but world redemption would remain impossible until the Jews changed, until the Jews accepted Christianity. And this is sort of the genocidal element of the civilizing process, as Elias writes about. The second phase was the racist phase. So the Jewish race was perceived as inferior, but more than that, not just inferior, but polluting the purity of the so-called white Aryan race or nation. So the Jews had to be removed to stop the polluting of the white race, and this was resulting ultimately in pogroms and ultimately in the Holocaust. So these types of anti-Semitisms with an S, these two types of anti-Semitism, if anybody at Columbia University or in the New York Times would speak in these terms, they would, I think, 99.9% of the time, they'd be ostracized from the institution, from society. There's no tolerance for this old form of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitisms. In its time, it dominated society or societies. Today, those forms of anti-Semitism are not that important, although in some places they seem to be re-emerging. The dominant form of anti-Semitism is an attack on Jewish peoplehood, So Israel, Zionism, the notion that Israel has a right to self-determination, or Jews have a right to self-determination in their homeland. So the demonization of Israel is not only acceptable, the demonization of Jewish people is not only acceptable, it's celebrated. If you want to get a good job at a good university or at the New York Times as opposed to somewhere in some little town somewhere in the middle of nowhere, you gain your bona fides by critiquing the Zionist entity. This is the predominant view. Now Jews, many Jews in this country, many Jews in this city, believe that was a problem for it was like the shtetl Jews versus the German Jews. This is the Zionists, these are the Israelis, our poor cousins, with their crazy policies and their crazy situation. It's a problem for the Jews over there. But what's been happening as the demonization of Israel and Jewish peoplehood was allowed to be tolerated and included, now Jewish communities and students on campuses who have an affinity to Israel, the Hillels, the Chabads in this place, or in Montreal, or in Europe, or synagogues that pray towards Jerusalem, they are now perceived as the enemy. And if you support the racist, Zionist, colonial, apartheid, fascist, whatever entity, and you're in a liberal, postmodern space like Columbia or McGill or the New York Times, you're the enemy. You're the enemy of progressive, liberal, human rights thought. Right? You are lending credibility and credence to a kind of an apartheid-like situation. So you're the enemy at Columbia, you're the enemy at McGill, you're the enemy in the suburbs of Paris, where synagogues are now protected by paramilitary squadrons, and it's coming here. The security is increasing. Professor Larry Amsel wanted to write an important study on how quietly our cities are changing. Quietly, the level of security in our Jewish institutions and the invisibility of our Jewish institutions in New York City, the capital of the diaspora Jewish world, is changing rapidly. The security in our institutions are changing rapidly, and yet nobody spoke about anti-Semitism, nobody spoke about the problems. Larry, his observations are very important. So it began with the demonization of the Jews in Israel, and it's coming here. And this type of anti-Semitism, it's not to say there's contradictions and problems in Israel, and we don't all agree with what's going on in Israeli society or its policies, but the fact that students in this university will protest Israel or a policy of Israel while there's a genocide happening, while there's major things happening in the world, that Israel becomes the sort of focal point. The demonization of Israel is the anti-Semitism of today, and it's bleeding into diaspora communities. It's coming here, and you're right. The Klinghoffer opera was unbelievable. I attended it. I went to the opening night to see and to experience it, and there's no other opera that would celebrate the hatred of any other group if it were not for this sort of anti-Semitism. So it was good to be there. So
Thank you.
thanks.
I benefited from your knowledge on previous occasions. I may, two questions. I hope you treat it as academic. It's not about academia.
Okay.
But in the 50s and 60s, before we were born, we saw also a clash of extremes and ideologies in this country too. There was great fear of communism, and then of course there was also those who supported Senator McCarthy, on the other side. And yet there was also a force that was predominant, and that was an anti-communist, liberal thinking among many, not just politicians, but among many in the academy. What has changed so that does not, we don't have that today? And my second question is about the topic of lecture. I thought tonight you would also focus more on anti-Semitism in the alt-right. You did mention one line, how the reactions by people who feel dispossessed is that they turn to hate. But could you talk more about that?
Okay. So can you please repeat the first question, because I didn't quite get the question.
Is why today do we not have what has changed in your learned opinion, so that we don't have a predominant or a persuasive body of opinion that would be the child of the anti-communist liberals of the 50s and 60s?
Okay, so for the alt-right, so yeah, I wanted to focus more on it, but I got sidetracked. But I also tried to make the connection between, I think, marginalization and globalization, postmodernity, and sort of the silence of the liberal intellectuals or the liberal politics of the day, or politique of the day. And sort of the silencing, the political correct politics, the silencing of criticism against these reactionary social forces, the implosion of the Middle East states failing, genocide, and somehow we were sort of sitting here thinking that this is not going to quite affect us. And then the crisis, the refugee crisis, which could have been avoided at so many levels, from stopping the catastrophe to creating a no-fly zone, and people don't want to leave their homes and whatever. Nothing was done to help the refugees, to help the situation. Things were done to exacerbate the situation for short-term gain, perhaps. But so I was saying that our silence to this catastrophe and to this implosion, and our inability to to garner a humane response from the global community is coming back to bite us. And I think there was sort of an intellectual reason why we didn't engage this catastrophe. And that has created a vacuum. And I think our short-term neoliberal politics, economic and political politics, has marginalized a lot of people in this country and certainly in Europe. And with the sort of the movement of a lot of people settling into areas of cities and of spaces that are occupied by the kind of marginalized local French and American or British or Spanish citizens, or Italian citizens, the people on the street are moving, they're scared, they're upset, they're frightened. They're not getting responses from their intellectual leaders or their political leaders because the political leaders are doing politics for short-term gain, ensuring Boeing, ensuring Siemens, ensuring deals for $150 billion with a regime that's helping a genocide. And this is giving rise to European nationalism. And I think European nationalism is sort of rifting off Donald Trump's election, and Trump is sending back some invigoration to the European nationalists, and we sort of have this thing going in the West now. And where it ends and where it goes, nobody knows. But it's dangerous. And the alt-right is not just a movement of marginalized white Americans. There is an intellectual basis of it and for it, and I think we should become acquainted with it. And we should understand it and study it and understand how there is a space for this movement, I think, to grow. And what are the implications? And why is this happening?
And yet the alt-right, it seems, is a paradox to the way scholars think of the progression of anti-Semitism, the contemporary one being anti-Zionism.
Yeah.
Because they seem to support Israel, but they hate Jews.
So I'm not certain. I don't know the answer. I don't know if they support Israel. I think some of them. I'm not an expert at this, so I really don't know. I'm not being humble. It seems that there's an element of the alt-right among the thinkers, so-called thinkers, who I think are just anti-Semitic and they hate Jews and they hate Israel. And I think there's some who probably want all the Jews to get out of the United States and end up in Israel, so they'll support Israel. And yeah, so some of them are pro-Israeli. And then I have to say that I think Pence and the UN ambassador have been saying amazing things about radical political Islam and its anti-Semitism in a manner that has not ever been spoken in this country ever by the Obama administration or by previous administrations. You know, so that's refreshing, but at the same time, you know, the blurring of the separations of power in this country, the attacks on the judiciary, the attacks on immigrants and migrants and minorities is alarming. You know, so there's all kinds of things in the air that the professor that I was with last night, who's a professor of psychology, was saying almost this country is becoming bipolar in a way. Oh, there's great things happening, there's scary things happening.
So what's different? What was in the 50s and 60s that allowed for the persuasive plurality of thought by anti-communist liberals that you don't have today?
So I don't know. You know, the situation. So I'm not exactly clear of your question, but I would just say that the conditions are quite different. In the 1950s and 60s, you have the United States of America emerging from World War II, kind of at the cusp of its power and development. The economy is growing. It's the major hegemonic power. It's a superpower. It's growing, developing rapidly. It's the place to be. Today, the world's different. The economy, the global economy, is problematic. Certainly in the Middle East and now in Europe and the United States. So neoliberalism, globalization, the blurring of national identities and boundaries, which now Trump is trying to reimpose. I think the conditions are different. And what's interesting about radical political Islam, unlike capitalism or communism, It's that it's an anti-systemic movement, it's an anti-capitalist movement, it's an anti-materialist movement. So ideologically, I mean, they're trying to grab power, they're trying to grab material power, but they also believe in things that communists and capitalists and us materialists don't quite believe in or understand. It's different. Emmanuel Wallerstein writes about this in an interesting way. Yeah.
But what you just said about not being able to face the Islamic world because they're not materialistic and
Political Islamist world, yeah.
much, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, much of the fanaticism is based on, spiritual and religious things. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. And that is, it seems to me that there's a conflict in the intellectual world that has to do with nationalism becoming equated with xenophobia. And in a situation where nationalism becomes bad, then Israel, by definition, is certainly bad. Because it's not only a nation, but it's also a religious, a nation identified with a particular religion and ethnicity and so on and so on. So there is a conflict there. Let's say George Soros brought it to a heightened position among some people. But there's a conflict there that people, I don't hear anybody addressing and sort of clearing the air about.
Okay, so yeah. So it's a good point. So I'll answer briefly because I would like other people to participate too. But very quickly, there's a group called the Quilliam Foundation. It's a group of Muslim intellectuals based in London who are Muslims, most of them are practicing Muslims, who are fighting anti-Semitism and political Islam. And they're fighting anti-Semitism because they see anti-Semitism as the greatest threat to the Muslim world. Because everybody's talking about Israel and the Jews, and they're destroying families and mosques and societies. So it's a Muslim problem, and they understand it. It's very interesting. And I think your point about Israel is important, and it ties into what I was trying to say about postmodernity. And you're right. If Jewish people have a strong identity and a strong connection to Israel, and Israel is a modern sort of nation state, and it's a social democracy, but it's also, there's a strong cultural nationalist identity associated with Israel. It's the home of the Jewish people. And in the age of postmodernity, when we're all supposed to be hybrid and we're all supposed to be kind of similar, and we are insisting on being we're distinguishing ourselves and being unique and having a kind of a modern identity as opposed to a postmodern hybrid identity. So Israel sort of flies in the face of this sort of postmodern intellectual moment. And Daniel Sibony, who's a professor of philosophy and psychoanalysis in France, he wrote how when a philosophical and kind of intellectual worldview begins to crumble, very few people take the opportunity to say, well, maybe there's something wrong with my belief system. Maybe there's something wrong with what I was writing about or thinking about. What usually happens psychologically when a world order begins to fail or the worldview begins to fail, people kind of become entrenched. They re-entrench themselves and they start to attack the messenger. So this is what Daniel Sibony is looking at. So when the Islamists, when Iran becomes nakedly anti-Semitic or sexist or racist or anti-democratic, or the Muslim Brotherhood is exposed and there's genocide and the states are failing and there's an implosion, you would think that liberal human rights activists would wake up and say something in the name of liberalism and human rights and their worldview. And Sibony is saying very few people can do it because when your worldview is sort of falling apart, you kind of shoot the messenger and you kind of double down. That's interesting. Anyways, thank you.
Going back quite a ways, when I was a child, I remember finding out I was Jewish and finding out in a very bad way that it was a bad and I spent some time thinking about it. And there is a question.
Where was this? Where?
In Silver Spring, Maryland. there was a feeling that Israel had to be protected, and it was an American feeling behind Israel among all people. It wasn't Republican, and then Lebanon happened, and that, I kind of see Lebanon as the moment where all of a sudden the world looked at Israel and say, "Up, just American hegemony," and then the Muslims, and I believe that the public relations has really done an amazing job changing Europe. So the question is, do you think that allowing Muslims to come into this country as well as other countries in the world is ultimately going to be the end of rational thinking with regard to Israel and possibly with anything else? I mean, do you see them as capable of taking over the entire world?
So that's a politically incorrect question, but it's an important question. Yeah, I know. So it's interesting. So last night I was watching the BBC News, and there was Netanyahu's in Australia for the first time. First time a prime minister went to Australia, and there was massive protests in Sydney against, I think it was Sydney, against his visit. And I was surprised because Australia is a pretty friendly country, democratic. It's a little bit like Canada. It's friendly to Israel. And I looked closely at the flags and the banners, and it was a large crowd of people supporting Hezbollah and Hamas, and they looked like they were from the Middle East. They didn't look like they were of British origins. And the Arab lobby, which nobody speaks about, is extraordinarily well organized. And, we struggle at ISGAP to have, so we're the only research center in the academy fighting anti-Semitism. So we try to get money from Jewish foundations and philanthropists. And we're struggling. We're small. But if you look at the money, the billions of dollars that are being pumped into and creating very important research centers, very important chairs of departments, within departments. It's massive. So here we are, struggling at $1 million a year, and these guys are creating universities, and important. I mean, Georgetown has Oxford Islamic Studies. If you're a professor of Islamic Studies from Oxford and you walk around the world, the doors are open everywhere. Very important. So the impact of this reactionary social movement in the West, but also, most importantly, as our colleagues at the Quilliam Foundation say, in the Arab world, the emergence, the domination of Islamism over Muslims, that's where the real conflict is, and it's affecting Muslims and diaspora communities. So what do you do with immigrants and migrants? So I think, first of all, it's international law and American law to allow refugees to claim refugee status. And then they're supposed to have a hearing. So if somebody feels that their lives are in jeopardy, I think we're morally obligated, given history, to take people in and then let them have process where it's determined whether they're a real refugee or not. So I think refugee issues are a profoundly human issue that we should take very seriously and never turn our back on refugees. And there are more and more refugees, and the task is more and more difficult. But I think we have to remain humane. In terms of immigration, I think that I don't think you can exclude Muslims. I don't think you can exclude a religious group in this country. I think, as we've seen, it violates the law, it violates the Constitution, and I think rightfully so. But we're not obligated, the United States or other democracies are not obligated to take people in. And I think the question should be, the issue should be, if somebody wants to become a citizen of a democracy, we should not exclude them based on race or religion or gender, sexual orientation. They should be allowed to become citizens. But I think there could be a way to ascertain whether they want to live in a democratic society or not. And if they want to do honor killings, or if they want to subjugate women, or they don't allow, as in France, they don't allow women to go into cafes anymore because it's un-Islamic. Well, if you're in France, it's a democracy, and women can go and have a coffee. You don't have to, you can maybe not in your mosque or maybe not in your house, but in public, a citizen has the right to do what they want, if it's legal. So I would say that we should have, our criteria should be based on democratic practices. If somebody doesn't want to participate in a democratic society and be a citizen of a democracy, they don't have to come. I'm not as,
When a Muslim child from Syria who's automatically anti-Jewish and anti-Israel and will never change, that's that has to be challenged. Oh, I have Muslim friends. How many yeshivas work in Brotherhood? You may have. I have friends. I'm not saying you don't.
Not all Muslims are bad, okay, but doesn't matter.
What I tell you is, every time you show me a Syrian refugee suffering, I shed a tear. But when you show me thousands and thousands of them coming into the country, eventually, not Syrians, but Muslims who are very stable and very developed in this country, coming in with that attitude. As a Jew, I'm not so interested in pushing forward with that.
yeah.
And I want to know why the Jewish community, the liberal Jewish community, doesn't see that in the end there will be no Jews left.
Right. So first of all, very few people get to this country as refugees for geographical and all sorts of other reasons. So it's not, I don't think there's a refugee problem in this country. Or I don't know, maybe that's incorrect. There's illegal workers or whatever. The borders are open. There's issues. What?
I was going to say, our illegal immigration is from the south, typically not from the east.
But from the south, there's all kinds of people coming. So there's, Iranians are coming and Middle Eastern people are coming through the south. We don't understand the implications of it, but it's happening. Yeah, look, these are challenging issues, and I think refugees, if refugees come here, they're entitled to claim status and they're entitled to a legal process to determine if they're refugees or not. And if they're not refugees, goodbye. If somebody comes to this country and they're sexist or homophobic or anti-Semitic, it's a serious issue. And they are.
Definition.
It's a serious,
yeah. Like that, and that's their Sharia law.
yeah. It's look, I don't have an easy, to be honest, I don't have an easy answer. But not just as a Jewish person, as a citizen of a democracy and as a scholar and a liberal intellectual, these are very serious issues. Barbara.
Thank you very much for that talk. I wonder if you could respond to the question that kind of baffles me, and that is why Western countries are not pressuring the Muslim countries, and there are so many of them throughout the world, to take in the refugees and the migrants refuse.
So I mean, I'll tell you why. There's a look. It's not. I don't have the answers at all, and it's a multi-layered, complicated, complex situation. But one element of this is the fact that large companies in Europe and in the United States and other countries need cheap workers, and the German corporations and companies were starving for labor because Germans are not reproducing. There was a shortage of workers. And the refugees and illegal refugees with no rights serve a purpose. So these are short-term gains. So Merkel lets in more than 1 million, of which 400,000 apparently have disappeared from the from the bureaucracy. It's a big problem. But there are interests within our democratic society that want this to take place for negative reasons. And I think there's some of us who want it to happen for positive reasons. It's complicated.
Two big population centers of Israel and the United States. I think part of the problem is tremendous divides in both of them. In Israel, you have religious and left-right divide, and they're demonizing each other. Same here. You have the very liberal Jews and you have the more Orthodox. seems like this is part of the problem.
Yeah. So there's a political, sure, schism in the United States and Israel and other countries. I agree. Yeah. Please. Yeah.
I'm a little confused about the definition of the alt-right, which we ought to be so fearful of. When, the way I understand your lecture, everything you describe, which is the fearful left, the anti-Semitic left. So, what are we to fear more, the alt-left, if there is such a word, or the alt-right, which is always defined, especially by you at the moment, as something we have to fear?
Yeah.
So we have to fear both. So
Yeah.
where do we stand?
So, yeah, it's a good point. So I think Alan Dershowitz has been saying these days,
Thinks like a conservative.
but he's saying that we have to critique the extreme left in the Democratic Party and the left in the United States, and we have to critique the extreme right in the Republican Party.
Antisemitism is coming from the left.
Not well. So I would agree that the dominant form of anti-Semitism, or the largest form, the most dangerous form, or the most prevalent form of anti-Semitism, it's not even left. It's not left, because to be left, if you're a liberal, if you're a social democrat, if you're a socialist, and even if you're a communist on the extreme left, right? What do you believe in? You believe in strong citizenship, redistribution of wealth to some extent. You believe in strong citizenship. You don't believe in religion, or you don't think religion should govern society. It should be a secular society officially.
And that Israel is always at fault. The biggest problems in the world are caused by Israel, and that's even by Jews who are on the left.
So I think liberalism in this country is not quite liberalism.
Well, it isn't anymore, but they define themselves that way. So they've hijacked the word, and that's now becoming the meaning.
Agreed. So whatever the element of society that supports reactionary social movements claim to be liberal is a profound contradiction. And they should be called out, and they should be attacked for supporting anti-democratic forces, subjugation, genocide, and the like. And we've been arguing for a long time that this is a very important issue. The alt-right is emerging, I think, now. It has a long history in this country. White supremacy and white nationalism and racism and segregation played a deep role in the society, and there's a legacy. And people are now on the alt-right tapping into it, and they are white supremacists, and they are anti-Semitic. And it's not a bunch of crazy people that came from space. And there's a legacy in this country that it speaks to people. And there's people doing research on Patrick Dubois, Father Patrick Dubois from France, Georgetown, doing research now on the second generation of perpetrators. People doing research with speaking to the descendants of slave owners and of racists from the 1930s and 40s and 50s. What the young, the sort of second and third generation think of their parents or grandparents and what they did and what they stood for. And it's shocking stuff. I don't know how these people do the research, but bringing in the researcher to show the trophies of things that have been looted, and ropes that hung people, and ways that they killed and raped Jewish women. Proud. They're proud of that heritage.
And the desecration of the cemeteries. However, is there any proof that's the alt-right and that it's the alt-left masquerading? I mean, it may be both, it may be, how do we know?
I think there are white supremacists, there's legacy, there's racist, there's white.
Of course.
They're here. And what's interesting, what ties them together, the alt-right were supportive of Nazi ideology, white supremacy. The extreme nationalists in Europe, white supremacists. And the Islamists took the ideology of white supremacy, of racism, of fascism, of Nazism, and fused it into Islam. So it's sort of three branches of the same root playing out today. Your thoughts?
I sympathize with those who would like to come to this country because of all the crazy stuff that's going on, whether it's in anybody's country. I guess more so in Syria than anywhere else, at least for now. That will change. But I have more sympathy for those family members in the United States who will lose family members due to the inevitability of terror here. Now, this whole thing about vetting and asking questions, are you asking, are you a terrorist, are you a homophobe, are you this, are you that, which would disqualify them? You really think they'd give an honest answer if they intend to blow up? How can, I don't understand this thing about vetting. I just don't get that.
Yeah, so
They're not going to tell you, yes, I'm a terrorist. I come here for the sole purpose of blowing up as many.
First of all, so again, so the question is how Muslims coming to this country are not going to share their anti-Semitic racist views or their terrorist inclinations. And vetting won't do it for the Muslim immigrants.
Basically.
So first of all, I believe, and I think surveys and analysis shows the vast majority of Muslims are not terrorists.
Right, I agree.
Actually, the greatest target and victim of this terrorism are Muslims.
Right, I agree. I agree.
So it's very important not to demonize the entire group. I think we should attack and not tolerate this reactionary social movement, which is powerful. And like Nazism, fight it. Fight it politically, fight it ideologically, and if necessary, fight it physically in a defensive manner, not to hurt people. And if you have to, I think you have to defend yourself. I think democracy is about, every generation has to defend democratic principles. I'm Jewish because my mother's Jewish. I didn't have a choice. I am Jewish. But if we want to live in a democratic society, you don't necessarily inherit it. You have to defend it and protect it. I think demonizing a group of people is anti-democratic. And at the same time, societies can be resilient to enemies.
It's not demonization, though. You spoke about, there were those who were cowed into silence. I could be cowed into silence because of the statement I just made, the question that I asked.
Right.
But I won't be cowed into silence because I don't want to lose American lives. And we're accepting the fact that, like I said, it's inevitable. It will happen again. And what are we going to say then? Are we ever going to come to the point?
So how do we defend ourselves? So do we defend ourselves against Muslim immigrants? Yeah, we should. And I think there's ways to vet people. I'm a Canadian Israeli. I'm becoming an American citizen. I've been vetted. Trust me. You can't become a citizen easily in this country. They know a lot about me. And I think they know more about me than I imagine. Right? There's a vetting process. They know where I went, where I studied, references. It's a whole long process. It can take 10 years. Right? I'm vetted. And there's ways societies can defend and protect themselves. But the question is, what about Boeing? What about Boeing? They did a $25 million contract with Iran. Nobody's talking about Boeing the way we speak about Muslims. The fact that this university takes a lot of resources and funds from reactionary social forces, do we really complain about it, or we're just going to focus on the Muslims? So I think we have to be careful to defend democratic principles and look at the forces. Yes, some Muslims, but yes, some parties in our society are, I think, not trying to defend our democratic practices and freedoms. I think that should be a great concern. Sir? Larry?
So, it seems to me that, the question of refugees, the question of refugee refugees, the question of, Islamic anti-Semitism. the shoulders of the refugees. The people who are at fault here is the larger American society, especially the opinion classes, as you so beautifully described in this, who make it okay for Islamic kids and college kids to be anti-Semitic. If we've learned anything in the last 50 years, it's that human beings are educable. 50 years ago, most Americans were racist against black. 20 years ago, most Americans hated gays or felt that it was right to be prejudiced against gays. Human beings are educable. And the societal norms, please let me finish. Please, I didn't interrupt anyone. I will not be interrupted. If society, if we were honest, as you're talking about, if we were honest, if an Islamic kid came to university and there was an honest discussion of the fact, okay, that it's not okay to be anti-Semitic, even if you're from an Islamic background. It's just not okay. Just like it's not okay if you're a Jewish background to hate Muslims. That's made very clear from the first second you step on campus. If we made the other thing clear, if we made it clear that was okay, right, then some poor Syrian kid could come to this country who needs refugee, and we wouldn't have to be afraid of it. It's not their fault. It's our fault.
It's a very important point. And I think that ties into this notion of standing up for democratic values and defending the notion of citizenship.
I'm just reflecting backward. I think the pieces of what you said so beautifully.
We have 5 more minutes.
My sort of question is, in Europe, actually, the general sentiment is not like the sentiment in this room. The general sentiment in Europe is actually that people don't see a problem with taking in more refugees. The majority of Europeans you talk to don't seem to have a problem with this. Now, there's an undercurrent that's rising, which is...
I don't know who you talk to, but the majority do think it's a big problem.
No, actually...
And they want to go, especially the Jews. I can't
No,
go to
no.
a stop there.
The Jews, yes. The European society in total. So, and especially, and especially in Sweden, like you do interviews in Sweden as things are heating up in Sweden. The majority of Swedes think, especially in my demographic, think that it's age demographic, think that it's everything's fine and dandy. Why do you think that they're so unable to see the literal destruction of towns and cities in their country, which is far more exaggerated than anything that we're seeing in the United States, and yet Americans are far more reactive to the issue than people in Europe?
More reactive in what way?
For example, you had a large percentage of the population that voted for Trump. You see these kinds of motives discussed more often in the media. You see a challenge to sort of the hegemony of the left on social media in the United States, where you don't see it in Europe. You have police in the United States who aren't, I don't know what you want to call it, ashamed of going after minority communities if there is violence in minority communities, whereas in Europe, that's actually cut out of the news. Like, for example, when you had the rape in Cologne, the German government actually told the media not to report on the rapes for 2 days, and the police complied. And you have I forget the name of it, the rape scandal in the UK, where you had a Muslim rape gang that went around and molested boys, and it was only found out through an investigation that the police had actually covered it up because they didn't want to appear racist for having investigated it. So I'm trying to understand because the problem is much more acute in Europe. You have larger percentages of Muslims. The Muslims are typically more violent than the ones that come to the United States because of the proximity, because of the lack of vetting procedures in Europe. Since the situation is so much dire in Europe, you would expect that there would be a much stronger reaction in Europe to the problem, and yet there isn't. So I'm trying to figure out why there's the disproportionate mental response.
It's a good question, and it's important. But I think, so at one level, I agree with you. I think at one level, in Western Europe, with sort of social democratic societies or the state, regulated societies, engaged in society at a much greater level than the United States, for good or for bad. So I think there's more, in a way, more social cohesion. There has been more social cohesion, at least since the end of the Second World War, in Europe, in a sense, until now. Canada is similar. Education, healthcare, infrastructure, citizenship is stronger and more integration happening. But I think you see, Brexit is the first significant crack in that. I think nationalists in France, the nationalists in Greece, the nationalists in Romania,
Hungary.
the Netherlands. I think in Sweden you're starting to see a backlash as well. So where this goes, I don't know. But I believe, in France, I was there in September. I used to live in France, Paris, and I have friends and colleagues there. And it reminds me, I'm not exaggerating, you feel like you're in Jerusalem during the first Intifada. That's how Paris feels. I lived in Jerusalem during the first Intifada. If you go to Paris, there is a similar feel to the air. It's almost a city almost under siege. And people are moving and people are planning to leave. And the Jewish community, the chief rabbi of France said there is no future for his community in France. That's a heavy indictment. When the leader of the Jewish community is saying there's no future. That's France. That's where democracy and enlightenment began. So, can it be repaired? Can this process stop? I hope so.
Too late.
I hope.
We can stop it here.
I think we're facing a crisis in Europe, and I think the crisis cannot be no man's an island. It's a global crisis. Final question.
Yeah, okay. I think I forgot what I was going to ask, but I do want to tell you that I got involved with ISGAP because of the Pinhoffer. When it was shown, and that's when I found out about the organization. So, this support of it. I really have trouble waking up every day. I live on the Upper West Side. I used to call myself a liberal. Who are you? I was a Democrat my whole life, no more. Independent.
Not that.
And I was walking to a JTS course 2 Mondays ago, and there was some speaker at the one of the auditoriums right on Broadway. I don't know because I was trying to late for my class. A huge demonstration. The kids saying horrible things about Israel, the killers, this and that. I, a 71-year-old woman, told them where they could go. I did, but I have many Jewish friends, colleagues. I was a teacher professor for many years. You cannot talk. You can't open your mouth. They'll think, oh, you voted for Trump, or whatever, Or Obama was the Messiah. You couldn't talk against him. I did not vote for that man. I'm not interested in identity politics. He's a lot responsible for what's going on today, not just with Syria, but in the larger picture, and the mentality and the stupidity of people, that they don't see anything in a nuanced way. Your binary thing, absolutely. And I feel like it's all to the good to say we need to not have the vacuum of the silence, but who do we talk to? How do we talk? The minute you say anything, you're not even, you're a Zionist. You're shut down.
I have a good answer for you.
Let me hear your answer.
No. So I have a colleague. So we do this Oxford program. Barbara was there, and Ari's coming. So my colleague Femi Vaughn. Femi is a Nigerian guy, professor. He's at the Wilson Institute at Gordon College. We studied at Oxford together. And he teaches now on the history of jihad. It's amazing. So the 3 waves of jihad and how Africa has been influenced by jihad. So we don't even. It's amazing. So he really complements our work in a profound way. A great scholar, a good friend. And we were students at Oxford together. And we met Paul Robeson's son, who was a civil rights activist. Paul Robeson, Columbia. So Femi was complaining about West Africa, corruption, his family, his infrastructure, and racism in the kingdom. And I was talking about antisemitism and all, I was a student, but still kind of studying and speaking about similar things. And he was listening to us very politely. And we went on, the 2 of us were going on in the pub after his lecture, a brilliant lecture. And he listened to us for a long time, and he finally said, I've been hearing you complain. And the 2 of you are in Oxford.
A what?
You're in Oxford. were born in the 1960s. You have all this opportunity. Yes, there are problems. Yes, there are problems. And look where you are, and look where your friends are, and look at how your life is better than your parents. And think about something. Think about your grandparents going through the Holocaust, and you turn to family and think about your great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents who were sold into slavery. And he said, you know, you guys have it pretty easy. And it's stuck with me. So, yes, these are very serious times. And they're getting, I sadly think they're getting more serious. And if you think about, you know, my grandparents' generation, it's amazing. There's a statistic that's mind-blowing. For the Jewish community, more than 90% of the Jewish community does not speak the same language or lives in the same country as their grandparents. Talk about a massive dislocation. And yet, we are at some level the most successful. We publish the most books, translate the most books, the most highly educated, and probably our DNA and genetically we're probably the most healthiest we've been in many, many, many generations. It's incredible. And compare our situation to our grandparents' situation. I'm sure we all have stories here, where we come from, what our families endured, depending on where we're from. So we can't have despair. And I think that we have to learn, we have to study, we have to become aware, and we have to think, we have to educate ourselves. I think Jews survived because we took education very seriously. And there's all types of ways to educate yourself now. And I think we have to become aware, and I think in a very serious, systematic way, find friends, find colleagues, and do something. And Sharansky, you know, he says that he was freed from solitary confinement in the Soviet regime by housewives and students. Housewives and students in this country brought down the Soviet Union. You know? Think of it. He was sitting on the verge of death, right? 3 million Soviet citizens, Jews, were stuck in that horrible society, horrible system. And today, there's more than 1 million Jews free in Israel. They're free to travel. I hope will continue. I was at a conference in Moscow. In 1984, I went to visit the refugees and Sharansky's family in Moscow. Anyways, there was a whole lot. I was there for 3 weeks. It was the longest 3 weeks of my life. And that was 1984. I was a crazy 19-year-old kid, but no fear. And I haven't been back until December. It was a big conference put on by the World Jewish Congress and the Russian Jewish Congress with support of the government on anti-Semitism. And I went back to Moscow, and it's unbelievable. Many synagogues, vibrant synagogues. I went into the synagogue that I was chased out of by the KGB in 1984. And I went into that synagogue, and there's study groups. It's teeming with people. They don't have enough space. Kosher restaurants. It's a vibrant, amazing community. In 1984, there was no hope. It was horrible. So we can't lose hope, and I think we have to, as citizens, educate ourselves and defend democratic principles. And I think we have to defend our principles and take a stand. And Brotherh was inspirational.
Permission, I would like to ask everyone if they would be interested in continuing these kinds of conversations at salons, Sunday salons, Saturday evening salons, in homes, or because Charles and I had talked about it. I think that there's a need for it. So,
Well, I'll host you in Greenwich, Connecticut, so we'll host you in Greenwich anytime.
well, we're happy to come. We're happy to come.
If you want to speak about your
They have an idea. That's the
Well, okay,
problem.
but however you want to